The letter said he had 7 days before losing everything. Daniel Brooks read the notice 3 times while sitting alone inside his aging pickup truck, parked beneath a gray morning sky outside a small bank in rural Montana. The words never changed. Final foreclosure notice. 7 days. The house would be seized. The property would be sold. The account would be closed. It was amazing how a few lines of black ink could make a man's entire future suddenly feel smaller. Daniel folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. For a long moment, he simply sat there. The engine was off. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Across the street, people walked in and out of coffee shops and grocery stores, carrying on with ordinary lives. Nobody knew that a father sitting alone inside an old truck was quietly trying to figure out how to tell his 11-year-old daughter that the only home she had ever known might soon belong to someone else. Daniel closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. Then he started the truck and drove to work. Life had a habit of moving forward even when people wished it would pause. The local airfield sat just outside town. Small aircraft lined the runways. Mechanics moved between hangars carrying tools and equipment. Daniel had spent most of his adult life there. He repaired engines, inspected aircraft, and solved problems nobody else wanted to solve. The work was honest. It paid enough to survive. Most years, that had been enough. Then medical bills from years earlier, rising costs, and a series of bad financial setbacks slowly pushed him toward a cliff he never saw coming. By lunchtime, his hands were covered in grease and engine oil. Yet even while working, the letter remained in his thoughts. 7 days. 7 days before Sophie lost her bedroom. 7 days before the porch where they watched summer sunsets belonged to someone else. 7 days before every memory inside that little house became something they could no longer touch. His phone buzzed. The screen displayed a picture of Sophie smiling with missing front teeth from several years ago. Daniel answered immediately. "Hey, kiddo. Dad, guess what?" Her excitement filled the speaker. "What happened?" "I got an A on my science project." Daniel smiled despite everything. "I never doubted you. Mrs. Harper said mine was one of the best in class." "That sounds about right." Sophie laughed. "You always say that." "Because it is always true." For a few minutes they talked about school, friends, and weekend plans. Simple things. Important things. Daniel listened carefully, memorizing every detail. He never wanted Sophie to hear the worry hiding beneath his voice. When the call ended, he stared at the phone for several seconds before slipping it back into his pocket. She deserved stability. She deserved safety. She deserved better than what he could currently provide. Yet somehow, even during the hardest moments, Sophie never seemed to notice what was missing. She only noticed what remained. Later that evening, Daniel pulled into the gravel driveway of their small white house surrounded by open fields and tall pine trees. The home was modest. Nothing special to anyone passing by. But to Daniel and Sophie, it was everything. The front porch still carried marks from a summer painting project years ago. Wind chimes moved gently beside the door. Flower pots lined the steps. Every corner held a memory. Sophie burst through the front door before he even reached it. "Dad, there she is." She wrapped her arms around him. Daniel hugged her tightly. Some days, that hug felt like the only thing keeping him standing. Inside, they prepared dinner together. Sophie talked while Daniel cooked. She described teachers, classmates, and dreams for the future. At one point, she began talking about college. Daniel smiled and encouraged her, but a small ache settled in his chest. He could handle losing almost anything. The idea of disappointing Sophie was different. Later that night, after Sophie fell asleep, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the ticking of an old wall clock. Moonlight filtered through the windows. The foreclosure notice rested beside a cold cup of coffee. 7 days. He looked around the room slowly. Family photographs hung on the walls. School drawings covered the refrigerator. A blanket Sophie left on the couch remained exactly where she dropped it. The house felt alive with memories. Daniel lowered his head and rubbed his eyes. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to admit how tired he felt. Then something unexpected happened. A distant sound rolled across the night sky. At first it was faint, barely noticeable. Daniel looked toward the window. The sound grew louder. Not thunder, not wind. An aircraft. He stood and stepped onto the porch. Far beyond the dark tree line, a small plane crossed the moonlit sky. Its lights flickered strangely. Daniel frowned. Years of experience around aircraft made him notice things others missed. And in that instant, something about the plane did not look right. Daniel stared into the darkness as the small aircraft moved unevenly across the night sky. Years of working around airplanes had trained his eyes to notice subtle details. A healthy aircraft moved with confidence. Predictably. Smoothly. This one did not. The lights flickered again. One wing dipped lower than the other before correcting. Then the engine sound changed. The shift was slight, but Daniel heard it immediately. Something was wrong. His pulse quickened. He stepped farther onto the porch and watched. The plane passed beyond the tree line before suddenly descending lower than it should have been. Much lower. Daniel's expression tightened. "No," he whispered. A moment later, the engine sound faded entirely. Silence swallowed the night. Then came a distant flash somewhere beyond the hills. Not a massive explosion. Just a brief burst of light followed by darkness. Daniel did not hesitate. He rushed back inside. Sophie was already halfway down the stairs, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Dad, stay here." "What happened?" "I think a plane went down." The words instantly woke her up. "A plane." Daniel grabbed his jacket and truck keys. "Lock the doors. Call me if you need anything. I will be back as soon as I can." Sophie looked frightened but nodded. She trusted him completely. Daniel kissed the top of her head and hurried outside. Within seconds, the old pickup was racing down a narrow county road beneath a sky filled with stars. Gravel scattered beneath the tires. Pine trees blurred past on both sides. Daniel followed instinct and experience. He knew roughly where the aircraft had disappeared. The drive felt longer than it actually was. Every minute mattered. Every second carried uncertainty. The deeper he traveled into the hills, the rougher the terrain became. Finally, he spotted something through the darkness. A faint orange glow among the trees. Daniel parked immediately and grabbed a flashlight. The night air smelled of smoke and fuel. His boots pounded across uneven ground as he pushed through brush and low branches. Then he saw it. The aircraft had come down in a small clearing. The fuselage was damaged, but largely intact. Broken branches surrounded the site. Smoke drifted upward into the cold night air. Daniel's heart pounded. He approached carefully, calling out as he moved. "Hello." No answer. "Can anyone hear me?" Still nothing. Then, faintly, a voice. Weak. Barely audible. Daniel followed the sound. Near one side of the aircraft, he discovered a woman trying unsuccessfully to free herself from debris. She appeared disoriented but conscious. Her dark coat was covered in dirt and leaves. A small cut marked her forehead. Yet her eyes remained alert. Determined. "Can you hear me?" Daniel asked. She nodded weakly. Relief crossed her face. "Thank God." Daniel immediately moved closer. "Do not try to stand yet." "The pilot?" she asked. "Was there anyone else?" Daniel scanned the area quickly. Emergency responders were not there yet. The clearing remained eerily quiet. "I will find out," he promised. He carefully helped her free one arm. The woman winced, but remained calm. "What is your name?" Daniel asked. She opened her mouth to answer, then paused. The effort seemed to exhaust her. "Evelyn," she managed. Daniel nodded. "I am Daniel." For a brief moment, their eyes met. Complete strangers connected only by circumstance and chance. Then a distant siren echoed somewhere beyond the hills. Help was coming, but it was still too far away. Daniel glanced toward the damaged aircraft. Smoke continued drifting upward. His instincts told him not to wait. "We need to move." Evelyn looked toward the darkness. "I cannot walk very far." Daniel did not waste time arguing. He carefully helped her to her feet. The moment she tried to stand, her knees nearly gave out. Without hesitation, Daniel supported her weight. Step by step, they moved away from the clearing. The path was uneven. Rocks and roots covered the ground. Yet Daniel never slowed. He focused entirely on getting her somewhere safe. Evelyn noticed something unusual during that difficult walk. Daniel never asked who she was. Never asked what she did for a living. Never asked why she had been on the plane. Most people would have, especially after seeing a private aircraft in the middle of nowhere. Daniel asked only one question. "Are you okay?" The answer remained the same every time. "I think so." Several minutes later, flashing emergency lights finally appeared through the trees. First responders arrived quickly. Paramedics rushed forward with equipment and stretchers. The clearing suddenly filled with voices and movement. Daniel stepped aside while professionals took over. Evelyn looked toward him as medics examined her. "Wait." Daniel turned back. What? She reached for his sleeve weakly. Thank you. Daniel smiled. Tired. Honest. Simple. You would have done the same for me. Evelyn wanted to say something else. Something important. But another group of responders surrounded her. Questions began. Assessments followed. The moment disappeared. Daniel stepped backward into the crowd. Sirens echoed through the darkness. Helicopter lights appeared overhead. The scene grew busier by the minute. Nobody noticed the mechanic quietly walking away toward his old pickup truck. Nobody except Evelyn. As paramedics guided her toward a waiting helicopter, she searched the crowd one last time. But Daniel Brooks was already gone, heading back to the little house he might lose in 7 days, completely unaware that this strange night was only the beginning of a story neither of them could yet imagine. By the time Daniel returned home, the eastern horizon was already beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. His body felt exhausted. His clothes smelled faintly of smoke and pine trees. Yet before he even stepped through the front door, Sophie was waiting for him. She sat curled beneath a blanket on the living room couch, fighting sleep. The moment she saw him, relief filled her face. You are okay. Daniel smiled softly. I am okay. Sophie immediately stood and wrapped her arms around him. Did everyone survive? The question lingered between them. Daniel hesitated. Some people were hurt, but help arrived. Sophie nodded slowly. That answer seemed enough for now. A few minutes later, after convincing her to return to bed, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table once again. The foreclosure notice remained exactly where he had left it. Strange how life worked. Only hours earlier, that letter felt like the biggest problem in the world. Then a plane had fallen from the sky. A stranger's life had hung in the balance. Suddenly, the letter seemed both smaller and heavier at the same time. Daniel folded it carefully and slipped it into a drawer before finally heading upstairs. Morning arrived far too quickly. By 8 o'clock, Daniel was already back at the airfield. News of the crash had spread throughout town overnight. Mechanics gathered near the hangar discussing details. Pilots shared theories. Local reporters occasionally stopped by searching for information. Daniel avoided all of it. He did not see himself as part of the story. He had simply done what anyone should do when another person needed help. At least that was how he viewed it. Around lunchtime, one of the younger mechanics approached him holding a phone. Did you see this? Daniel barely looked up from the engine he was inspecting. See what? The woman from the crash. Daniel paused. The younger mechanic turned the screen toward him. A news article filled the display. The headline mentioned a survivor being transported to a private medical facility in another state. The article contained very few details. No clear photographs. No biography. No explanation of who she was. Just speculation. Daniel glanced at the screen for less than 2 seconds before returning to work. Glad she made it. The younger mechanic stared at him. That is it. Daniel shrugged. What else should I say? The mechanic laughed and walked away. Daniel focused on the aircraft engine in front of him. Yet for a brief moment, he remembered Evelyn's face in the darkness. The fear in her eyes. The relief when she realized help had arrived. Then the memory faded beneath the demands of everyday life. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Evelyn Hayes slowly opened her eyes inside a private recovery suite overlooking a city skyline. Soft sunlight filtered through enormous windows. Machines monitored her condition quietly. The room was calm, elegant, secure. Yet her first thought was not about the crash. It was about the man who had carried her through the darkness. A physician entered moments later. Good morning. Evelyn immediately asked a question. The man. The doctor looked confused. Which man? The one who helped me. The physician smiled gently. You should focus on recovering. Evelyn ignored the advice. Did anyone identify him? Not yet. She stared out the window. For the first time in years, frustration appeared on her face. Evelyn was accustomed to finding answers quickly. Information normally came to her with a single phone call. Yet somehow, the identity of the man who saved her remained unknown. Later that afternoon, several advisors and executives arrived to check on her condition. They brought reports, documents, business updates. Evelyn listened politely for a few minutes before interrupting. Find him. The room fell silent. One executive blinked. Find who? The man from the crash. Another advisor exchanged confused glances with colleagues. We are still gathering information. Evelyn's voice remained calm but firm. Gather faster. Back in Montana, Daniel's problems were becoming harder to ignore. 3 days remained. The bank had already begun preparing final paperwork. Collection calls arrived more frequently. Every conversation ended the same way. Deadlines, balances, consequences. That evening, Daniel drove home carrying groceries and a smile he did not entirely feel. Sophie greeted him at the door holding a school project. "Can I show you something?" "Always." For nearly 20 minutes, she excitedly explained every detail. Daniel listened carefully. He asked questions. He laughed at the right moments. He pretended everything was normal. Then Sophie said something that nearly broke his heart. "I love this house." Daniel froze for half a second. Sophie continued without noticing. "When I am older, I want to remember every room exactly like it is now." The words struck harder than any foreclosure notice ever could. Later that night, after Sophie went to bed, Daniel sat alone on the porch. The stars stretched endlessly overhead. Wind moved softly through the pine trees. The house stood behind him, quiet and familiar. Every board, every window, every memory. 3 days remained. 3 days before strangers could take all of it away. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine what came next. Yet somewhere far beyond Montana, another person was already searching for him with growing determination. And with every passing hour, the distance between their two lives was becoming smaller. The next morning arrived with a strange mixture of beauty and dread. Sunlight spilled across the fields surrounding Daniel's house, turning the grass gold beneath a cloudless Montana sky. Birds moved between the pine trees. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh earth through the open windows. Everything looked exactly as it always had. That was the cruel thing about losing something. The world rarely gave warning signs. It simply looked normal until suddenly it was gone. Daniel stood on the porch holding a cup of coffee, watching Sophie wait for the school bus at the end of the driveway. She waved enthusiastically before climbing aboard. He smiled and waved back. The bus disappeared down the road. The smile faded almost immediately. 2 days remained. After work, Daniel drove to the bank for what he already knew would be another disappointing conversation. The building sat in the center of town, cold and polished behind large glass windows. Inside, everything felt efficient, organized, impersonal. People moved between offices carrying folders and paperwork. To them, a foreclosure was another file, another transaction, another line on a report. To Daniel, it was his daughter's future. Richard Coleman sat behind a large desk reviewing documents when Daniel entered. The bank manager barely looked up at first. "Mr. Brooks." Daniel sat quietly. "I wanted to ask one more time." Richard sighed softly. He had heard the request before. "The answer has not changed. I am working extra shifts." "I understand. I can catch up." Richard folded his hands. "The deadlines have already passed." Daniel glanced toward the window. The town moved peacefully outside. Cars passed. People walked by. Life continued. "That house is all my daughter has ever known." For a brief moment, Richard's expression softened. Then professionalism returned. "I am sorry." Daniel nodded slowly. Not because he accepted the answer, because he understood there would be no different answer today. When he left the bank, the afternoon sunlight felt strangely cold. He climbed into his truck and sat there for several minutes without starting the engine. Across the passenger seat lay a folder filled with overdue notices, payment schedules, and failed attempts to negotiate. Months of effort reduced to paperwork. Eventually, he drove home. The house appeared exactly as it always did when he turned onto the gravel driveway. White siding, small porch, flower pots, wind chimes, nothing extraordinary. Yet Daniel found himself studying every detail. The old swing Sophie loved, the tree where they hung holiday lights every winter, the fence they built together one summer weekend. Each memory felt more valuable now that time was running out. That evening, Sophie sat at the kitchen table working on homework while Daniel prepared dinner. The atmosphere felt normal until she suddenly asked a question. "Dad." "Yeah." "Why have you been sad lately?" Daniel froze. Just for a second. Long enough for Sophie to notice. Children often understood more than adults realized. "I am not sad." Sophie tilted her head. "You are." Daniel attempted a smile. "Am I that easy to read?" "Only for me." Her answer made him laugh despite himself. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Sophie quietly set down her pencil. "You know you can tell me things." Daniel looked at her across the table. His chest tightened. She was 11 years old. Too young to carry adult burdens. too young to worry about mortgages and banks and foreclosure notices. Yet she was also wise in ways that surprised him every day. He considered telling her the truth, then decided not tonight. Not yet. Everything will be okay. Sophie studied him carefully. Promise. Daniel hesitated. The pause lasted less than a second, but it felt much longer. Finally, he nodded. Promise. Later, after Sophie went to sleep, Daniel walked through the house room by room. He touched walls he had painted himself, straightened family photographs, paused beside a doorway marked with pencil lines recording Sophie's height through the years. Each mark represented a memory, a birthday, a season, a chapter of life. The realization struck him with unexpected force. He was not fighting for a building. He was fighting for a history. Hundreds of miles away, Evelyn Hay sat inside a private conference room reviewing a growing stack of reports. Her recovery had progressed quickly. Her determination had progressed even faster. Multiple investigators had spent days trying to identify the man who saved her. Finally, one of them entered carrying a thin file. We found him. The room became silent. Evelyn immediately looked up. The investigator placed the folder in front of her. Daniel Brooks, airfield mechanic, single father, lives outside a small town in Montana. Evelyn opened the file. A photograph rested inside. The moment she saw his face, she recognized him. The man from the darkness. The man who never asked for recognition. The man who disappeared before anyone could thank him properly. Then her eyes moved to the next page. The details there changed her expression completely. The room grew quiet. Very quiet. Because alongside Daniel's name sat information about financial hardship, foreclosure proceedings, and a home scheduled to be seized within 48 hours. Evelyn slowly closed the file. Her gaze became distant, thoughtful, determined. Outside the conference room window, the city skyline glowed beneath the setting sun. Inside, a decision was already beginning to form. And back in Montana, Daniel Brooks sat alone on his porch watching darkness settle over the fields, completely unaware that someone he barely remembered was now thinking about him with growing urgency. The following morning began with a silence that felt heavier than usual. Daniel woke before sunrise, not because of an alarm, but because worry had become more reliable than any clock. For several seconds he remained lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Then reality returned. One day remained. Tomorrow, the foreclosure process would move forward. Tomorrow, strangers could begin taking ownership of the house that held every important memory he and Sophie shared. He sat up slowly and listened. The house was quiet, safe, familiar. For now, downstairs, Sophie was already awake, standing on a chair in the kitchen attempting to make breakfast. Daniel walked in just as she nearly spilled pancake batter across the counter. I see a future chef in action. Sophie laughed. Or a future disaster. Daniel smiled and helped steady the bowl. Moments like these always seemed ordinary while they happened. Only later did people realize they were the moments worth protecting. During breakfast, Sophie talked excitedly about an upcoming school event. Daniel listened carefully. Every smile she gave him felt both comforting and heartbreaking. She was planning for weeks and months ahead. He was struggling to see beyond tomorrow. At the airfield, work offered little distraction. The closer the deadline came, the more difficult it became to focus. Several times Daniel found himself staring into space while holding tools he had used thousands of times before. By mid-afternoon, his supervisor noticed. You all right? Daniel forced a smile. Just tired. The older man nodded slowly. He knew there was more to the story. Small towns had a way of knowing things. Yet he respected Daniel enough not to press further. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Evelyn Hay sat inside a private conference room surrounded by legal advisors, financial analysts, and assistants. Multiple screens displayed reports. Documents covered the table. Yet her attention remained fixed on a single file containing Daniel's information. She had spent most of the night reading everything available. Airfield mechanic, widower, single father, financial hardship, foreclosure. The facts painted a picture of a man carrying far more weight than anyone should carry alone. What troubled her most was not his situation. It was the realization that he never mentioned any of it. During those difficult minutes after the crash, Daniel had every reason to focus on himself. Yet he focused entirely on her safety. Not once had he asked for help. Not once had he hinted at his struggles. One advisor cleared his throat. We have located additional information regarding the foreclosure. Evelyn looked up. And The process is scheduled to move forward tomorrow morning. The room became quiet. Another advisor spoke cautiously. There may not be much time. Evelyn glanced toward the city skyline beyond the window. Her expression remained calm, but something determined had settled behind her eyes. Then we do not have much time to waste. Back in Montana, Daniel's day ended with another drive home beneath a sky painted orange and gold. The fields stretched endlessly around him. Mountains rested in the distance. It was beautiful country, the kind people traveled hundreds of miles to photograph. Yet all Daniel could think about was the house waiting at the end of the road. When he arrived, he found Sophie sitting on the porch swing. "You are home early." "A little." She smiled. "Good." Daniel sat beside her. For a while they simply watched the sunset. Wind moved gently through the trees. The old swing creaked softly beneath them. Then Sophie surprised him again. "Dad." "Yeah. If something bad happened, we would still be okay, right?" Daniel turned toward her. "Why would you ask that?" She shrugged. "I do not know. Just wondering." Children often sense storms long before adults admitted they existed. Daniel swallowed hard. "As long as we have each other, we will be okay." Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder. "That is what I thought." The simplicity of her trust nearly broke him. Later that night, after she fell asleep, Daniel walked through the house once more. He lingered longer this time. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway marked by years of growth measurements. Every room felt like a chapter of their story. Eventually, he stepped onto the porch. The stars above Montana seemed endless. He sat quietly, accepting something he had fought for months. He might lose the house. He might lose the property. But he refused to lose himself. Bitterness would not help Sophie. Anger would not help Sophie. Self-pity would not help Sophie. Whatever happened tomorrow, he would face it with dignity. Not because it was easy, because she was watching. Far away, inside a private aircraft crossing the night sky, Evelyn stared through a window at the darkness below. The plane carried her westward. Toward Montana. Toward answers. Toward a man who still had no idea she was coming. She closed Daniel's file one final time. Outside, clouds drifted beneath the moonlight. Inside, a plan was already beginning to take shape. And as midnight approached, two lives moved steadily toward a meeting neither of them expected, while the clock continued counting down to the moment Daniel feared most. The day Daniel had dreaded finally arrived beneath a pale gray sky. Dawn spread slowly across the Montana countryside, washing the fields in soft silver light. Everything looked peaceful, too peaceful, the kind of morning that seemed almost cruel because it refused to acknowledge that a family's world was about to change. Daniel stood alone on the porch holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. He watched the sunrise in silence. The mountains rested quietly on the horizon. Wind moved through the pine trees. Somewhere nearby, birds greeted the new day. It looked exactly like every other morning they had spent in this house. That simple fact hurt more than he expected. Inside, Sophie was getting ready for school. She moved through her routine with the confidence of a child who believed home would always be waiting at the end of the day. Daniel wished he shared that certainty. When she came downstairs, she immediately noticed his expression. "You did not sleep much." Daniel managed to smile. "Maybe a little." Sophie stepped closer. "Dad." There was something different in her voice this time. Less childlike. More serious. "What is happening?" Daniel stared at her for a moment. He realized he could not keep protecting her with half-truths. Not anymore. Sophie deserved honesty. He pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down. She joined him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Daniel finally told her. Not every detail. Not every financial number. Just the truth. The bank was taking the house. They might have to leave very soon. He expected tears. Fear. Anger. Instead, Sophie sat quietly absorbing every word. When he finished, she looked down at her hands. The silence felt endless. Then she asked the question he feared most. "Did you try everything?" Daniel nodded immediately. "Everything I could." Sophie looked up. Her eyes glistened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I know you did." Those 5 words nearly broke him. Not because she was upset, because she believed him completely. Sophie stood and wrapped her arms around him. Daniel held her tightly. Neither spoke. They simply sat together while morning sunlight slowly filled the kitchen. Some forms of love did not need words. Later, after Sophie left for school, Daniel drove toward town. The meeting at the bank was scheduled for noon. He had no illusions left. No hidden plan. No miracle waiting around the corner. Only paperwork. Final signatures. Final conversations. The drive felt strangely calm. Almost peaceful. Acceptance had replaced panic. At the bank, employees moved through their normal routines. Phones rang. Printers hummed. Customers came and went. To everyone else, it was an ordinary Thursday. Daniel checked his watch. 40 minutes remained. Meanwhile, across town, a black SUV quietly entered the city limits. Another followed behind it. Then another. The vehicles moved with purpose but attracted little attention. Inside the lead vehicle sat Evelyn Hayes. She watched the streets pass through the window. Small businesses, local diners, hardware stores, the kind of town where people still greeted strangers. Her investigators had spent days gathering information. The more she learned about Daniel Brooks, the more one detail continued to stand out. Despite everything he was facing, not a single person described him as bitter, struggling. Yes, tired. Certainly, but never bitter. Evelyn looked down at a photograph taken outside the airfield. Daniel stood beside a small aircraft speaking with a young girl. Sophie. The image carried a simple warmth impossible to fake. One advisor sitting across from her broke the silence. Everything is moving forward. Evelyn nodded once. Good. There may be resistance. That is fine. The advisor smiled faintly. He had worked with Evelyn for years. He recognized that expression. Once she made a decision, changing her mind was nearly impossible. Back at the bank, Daniel entered Richard Coleman's office for what both men understood would be their final meeting. Richard appeared uncomfortable, more uncomfortable than usual. Daniel noticed immediately. Something wrong. Richard adjusted several folders on his desk. There have been developments. Daniel frowned. Developments. Richard hesitated. It was unusual to see confidence missing from his voice. The bank's ownership structure changed this morning. Daniel blinked. What does that mean? Richard looked toward the window before answering. Honestly, I am still trying to understand it myself. Outside, several unfamiliar vehicles had begun arriving near the building. Employees glanced through windows. Conversations quietly stopped. Something unusual was happening. Daniel followed Richard's gaze. Across the parking lot, black SUVs rolled to a stop. Doors opened. Men and women in professional attire stepped out carrying folders and briefcases. The atmosphere inside the bank shifted instantly. Curiosity spread from desk to desk. Richard stood. Nervousness flashed briefly across his face. Daniel had never seen that before. Who are they? Richard asked quietly. Nobody answered. Because at that exact moment, another vehicle arrived. The final one. Daniel glanced through the glass without much interest at first. Then the passenger door opened. A familiar figure stepped onto the pavement. For a second, he thought he was mistaken. The woman from the crash. Evelyn. She looked healthy now. Strong. Confident. Completely different from the injured stranger he had carried through the darkness. Yet there was no doubt. It was her. Daniel stared through the window as Evelyn looked toward the bank entrance. Their eyes did not meet. Not yet. But somewhere deep inside, Daniel felt the strange certainty that this ordinary Thursday was about to become something else entirely. For several seconds, Daniel could only stare through the bank window. The woman stepping out of the vehicle was unmistakably the same person he had carried through the forest after the crash. Yet everything else about her felt completely different. Gone was the frightened survivor wrapped in emergency blankets. The woman crossing the parking lot now moved with calm confidence. People around her immediately adjusted their pace. Advisors followed closely behind. Professionals carrying folders hurried to keep up. She did not demand attention. Somehow, attention simply followed her. Inside the bank, conversations faded. Employees looked toward the entrance. Customers paused mid-sentence. Even Richard Coleman appeared unsettled. The front doors opened. Evelyn entered. The room seemed to shift around her. Not because she was loud. Quite the opposite. Her presence carried a kind of quiet certainty that made everyone else instinctively pay attention. Daniel remained standing near Richard's office doorway, uncertain what any of this meant. Evelyn spoke briefly with several individuals who had accompanied her. Documents changed hands. Signatures were reviewed. Questions were answered. Every movement appeared deliberate, professional, important. Yet throughout the process, Daniel noticed something strange. Several times, her eyes searched the room, as though she was looking for someone specific. Finally, she found him. The moment their eyes met, a small smile appeared. Genuine. Relieved. Not the smile of someone meeting a business contact. The smile of someone who had been searching for days and had finally succeeded. Daniel felt completely out of place. He glanced behind himself, half expecting her to be looking at someone else. She was not. A few minutes later, Richard received a phone call. Whatever he heard immediately drained the color from his face. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to concern. When the call ended, he remained silent for several seconds. Daniel had never seen the bank manager look uncertain before. Richard slowly lowered the phone. "Mr. Brooks." "Yes." Richard seemed to choose his words carefully. "There have been additional developments." Daniel almost laughed. It felt like the phrase of the day. "What kind of developments?" Richard glanced toward the lobby where Evelyn stood reviewing documents. "I am still trying to understand everything myself." Meanwhile, several townspeople had begun gathering outside. News traveled quickly in small communities. Expensive vehicles parked outside the local bank naturally attracted attention. Curious faces appeared near windows. Questions spread through nearby businesses. Nobody seemed to know exactly what was happening, yet everyone sensed something significant was unfolding. Daniel still understood almost nothing. All he knew was that the foreclosure meeting he expected had somehow transformed into something entirely different. Yet despite the confusion, one thought remained clear. Sophie. He checked the time. School would end soon. Regardless of whatever was happening inside the bank, she still needed him. Daniel stepped outside and called the school office. A few minutes later, he arranged to pick her up personally. He wanted to be with her today, no matter what happened next. As he ended the call, a voice spoke behind him. "You left before I could thank you." Daniel turned. Evelyn stood several feet away. Up close, she looked healthier than she had after the crash. Stronger, more vibrant. Yet her eyes carried the same sincerity he remembered from that night in the woods. Daniel smiled politely. "Looks like you are doing better." "Because of you." He shook his head. "Because the doctors did their jobs." Evelyn laughed softly. "You really do not like taking credit." Daniel shrugged. "There is not much credit to take." For a moment, neither spoke. The parking lot remained busy around them. Yet somehow the conversation felt strangely private. Evelyn studied him carefully. "Do you always help strangers?" Daniel thought about the question. "I hope so. Even when your own life is falling apart." The question caught him off guard. His expression changed slightly. Not because she was wrong. Because she knew. Evelyn noticed immediately. "I am sorry." Daniel shook his head. "No. It is fine." A gentle breeze moved across the parking lot. Cars passed along the nearby street. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet beneath them, something important was happening. Evelyn looked toward the bank building. Then back at Daniel. "You never told me anything about yourself." Daniel smiled faintly. "You never asked." "Maybe I should have." "Maybe." Another brief silence followed. Then Evelyn spoke again. "I read about your situation." Daniel looked away toward the mountains beyond town. Embarrassment mixed with resignation. "Then you know I am not exactly having a great week." "I know you have every reason to be angry." Daniel surprised her with his answer. "Anger does not solve much." Evelyn stared at him. Most people in his position would have been furious, bitter, resentful. Yet standing there beneath the Montana sky, Daniel seemed more concerned about getting home in time to pick up his daughter than about the house he was about to lose. That realization affected her more than she expected. Across the parking lot, another group of executives exited the bank carrying updated documents. Their expressions looked serious, focused. One of them approached Evelyn and quietly handed her a folder. She opened it and reviewed the contents. Her expression remained unreadable. Then she closed it and looked back toward Daniel. Something had changed. The pieces of a much larger plan were finally beginning to fall into place. But Daniel could not yet see the picture. Not yet. All he knew was that the woman he rescued from a plane crash had somehow arrived at the exact moment his life was falling apart. And as the afternoon sun settled lower over the town, he found himself standing at the edge of a mystery that was far bigger than he ever imagined. The town had never seen anything quite like this. By late afternoon, rumors moved through streets, diners, and storefronts faster than traffic. People gathered near windows overlooking the bank. Business owners stepped outside pretending to take breaks while quietly watching the unusual activity. Nobody knew the full story, yet everyone sensed something important was unfolding. Inside the bank, tension continued building. Executives moved between offices carrying folders. Lawyers reviewed documents. Phone calls came and went. Richard Coleman spent most of the afternoon looking increasingly uncomfortable. For years, he had been the person delivering difficult news to others. Today, uncertainty had finally found its way to his side of the desk. Daniel remained strangely calm. The closer everything came to collapsing, the more peaceful he felt. There was nothing left to fight, nothing left to prove. He had done everything he could. That realization carried a painful kind of freedom. Evelyn noticed it too. As they sat across from each other in a quiet conference room, she studied the man who had saved her life. The file she carried described financial hardship, missed payments, foreclosure proceedings. Yet the person sitting before her did not resemble a defeated man. Tired, yes. Concerned, certainly. But defeated? No. You are not asking questions, Evelyn said. Daniel smiled faintly. I have been asking questions all week. About me. Daniel leaned back slightly. You do not seem eager to answer them. A small laugh escaped her. Fair enough. For a moment, silence settled between them. Then Daniel glanced toward the window. What exactly is happening here? Evelyn looked at him carefully. Something that should have happened a long time ago. The answer only deepened the mystery. Before Daniel could respond, someone knocked on the conference room door. One of Evelyn's advisors entered carrying additional paperwork. He whispered several updates. Evelyn listened attentively. Her expression remained composed. Yet Daniel noticed something in her eyes. Determination. Whatever she was doing, it mattered deeply to her. The advisor left. Evelyn closed the folder. I need another hour. Daniel frowned. For what? Trust me. Most people would have pushed for answers. Most people would have demanded explanations. Daniel simply nodded. All right. The response surprised her. Again, hours earlier she had expected to find a grateful stranger. Instead, she found a man whose character seemed stronger than his circumstances. Meanwhile, across town, Sophie sat inside an almost empty classroom waiting for her father. School had ended long ago. Most children had already gone home. She watched sunlight stretch across the floor and wondered why the day felt different. Eventually, Daniel arrived. The moment he saw her, his expression softened. Sophie immediately knew something had happened. Dad, come on. They walked together toward the truck. How bad is it? She asked quietly. Daniel glanced at her. You really do not miss much. Sophie shook her head. Not when it comes to you. Daniel smiled despite himself. During the drive home, he explained only part of the truth. A woman he had helped after the plane crash had come to town. Important meetings were happening at the bank. Nobody seemed certain what would happen next. Sophie listened carefully. Then she asked a question only a child could ask. Was she nice? Daniel laughed softly. Yes. Sophie nodded. That seems important. The answer stayed with him longer than expected. Back at the bank, the atmosphere shifted again as evening approached. New documents arrived. More phone calls followed. Employees exchanged increasingly confused glances. Several senior staff members gathered in private offices behind closed doors. Richard Coleman spent nearly 30 minutes reviewing a stack of papers before lowering them, with visibly trembling hands. Something enormous was happening. Something none of them anticipated. Outside, dark clouds began gathering across the Montana sky. The first hints of rain drifted over the mountains. Streetlights flickered on one by one. The town settled into evening. Yet inside the bank, nobody seemed ready to leave. Evelyn stood near a large window overlooking the parking lot. Her reflection stared back at her against the growing darkness. One advisor approached quietly. Everything is nearly complete. Evelyn nodded. Good. Tomorrow morning? Tomorrow morning. The advisor hesitated. He still does not know. Evelyn looked toward Daniel's file resting on the table. That is exactly how he would want it. Several miles away, Daniel tucked Sophie into bed. Their home felt unusually quiet. Every room carried the weight of uncertainty. Yet Sophie surprised him one final time before turning off her bedside lamp. Dad, yes. No matter what happens tomorrow, I am proud of you. The words struck him harder than any foreclosure notice ever could. Daniel sat beside her bed for a moment, unable to speak. Finally, he squeezed her hand. I am proud of you too. Later that night, he returned to the porch. Rain began falling softly across the fields. Wind moved through the trees. Tomorrow would decide everything. The house, the future, the life he had fought to preserve. Yet as he sat there listening to the rain, a strange feeling settled over him. Not hope exactly. Something quieter. A sense that unseen pieces were moving into place beyond his understanding. Across town, lights remained on inside the bank long after midnight. Final signatures. Final approvals. Final decisions. By dawn, a truth hidden behind closed doors would finally emerge. And when it did, the lives of Daniel Brooks, Sophie Brooks, and everyone inside that bank would never look quite the same again. The next morning arrived with clear skies. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the fields washed clean beneath a brilliant Montana sunrise. Daniel stood on the porch for a few quiet moments before waking Sophie. The air felt different somehow. Not lighter, not easier, just final. Whatever happened today would decide the future. Sophie joined him outside, holding a blanket around her shoulders. Neither mentioned the house. Neither mentioned the bank. They simply watched the sunrise together. Sometimes love looked like conversation. Sometimes it looked like silence shared between people who understood each other completely. An hour later, Daniel drove into town. Sophie insisted on coming with him. He tried to convince her to stay with a friend. She refused. "We face things together," she said. The words sounded so much like something he would say that he could not argue. By the time they arrived, a crowd had already gathered outside the bank. Curious residents stood along the sidewalk. Employees moved nervously between offices. Several unfamiliar vehicles remained parked near the entrance. Daniel felt every eye following him as he stepped out of the truck. Sophie slipped her hand into his. Together they walked inside. The lobby felt quiet. Not completely silent, just quiet enough for everyone to notice. Richard Coleman stood near the center of the room, holding a folder. He looked exhausted. The confidence that had once defined him seemed absent. Nearby stood Evelyn Hayes. Calm, composed, watching. Daniel approached slowly. "I guess this is it." Richard swallowed hard. "Actually, Mr. Brooks, things have changed." Daniel glanced toward Sophie, then back at Richard. "Changed how?" Richard opened the folder. Several pages rested inside. Legal documents. Ownership transfers. Final approvals. He looked uncomfortable delivering news for the first time in his career. Yesterday, the bank was acquired. Murmurs spread throughout the room. Daniel frowned. "What does that have to do with my house?" Richard hesitated. Evelyn stepped forward. The room became still. "Everything," she said quietly. Daniel looked at her, confused. Evelyn took a slow breath. "After the crash, I spent days trying to find the man who saved my life." The crowd listened. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. "I expected to find someone asking for recognition. Someone looking for a reward. Someone eager to tell his story." She smiled softly. "Instead, I found Daniel Brooks." Sophie squeezed her father's hand tighter. Evelyn continued. "A man who never mentioned his struggles. A man who never asked who I was. A man who carried a stranger through the darkness while his own life was falling apart." Silence filled the bank. The kind of silence that carries weight. Richard lowered his eyes. Several employees exchanged glances. Many were hearing the full story for the first time. Evelyn opened her own folder. "When I learned what was happening here, I made a decision." She paused. "Not because I owed a debt. Kindness should never be treated like a transaction." Her gaze remained fixed on Daniel. "I made the decision because people like Daniel Brooks should not be punished for being decent." Then she handed a document to Richard. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed it. Finally, he looked up. "The foreclosure has been canceled." Nobody reacted immediately. The words seemed too large to process. Daniel simply stared. Richard continued. "The mortgage has been restructured under new terms. The property remains yours." Sophie gasped softly. Tears instantly filled her eyes. Daniel remained motionless. Not because he was ungrateful, because he could barely believe what he was hearing. The crowd erupted into whispers. Relief. Surprise. Amazement. Yet Evelyn was not finished. "There is one more thing." The room quieted again. "A scholarship fund has been established for Sophie." This time Daniel looked genuinely stunned. Sophie covered her mouth with both hands. Evelyn smiled warmly. "Because every child deserves the opportunity to dream without carrying the weight of adult worries." For several seconds nobody spoke. Then something remarkable happened. Daniel shook his head. "You did not have to do any of this." Evelyn's eyes softened. "I know." That answer said everything. She had not acted out of obligation. She acted out of gratitude, respect, humanity. Daniel looked around the room. The same bank that had felt cold and hopeless now stood completely transformed. Yet the most powerful moment was not the canceled foreclosure, not the documents, not the applause beginning to spread through the crowd. It was Sophie. She threw her arms around her father and held on tightly. Daniel embraced her. Months of fear disappeared in a single moment. The room watched quietly. Some smiled. Some wiped away tears. Even Richard Coleman seemed affected, because everyone understood they were witnessing something larger than a financial decision. They were witnessing grace. Weeks later, life settled into a new rhythm. Daniel returned to the airfield. Sophie returned to school. The house remained filled with laughter, family photographs, and future plans. Evelyn occasionally visited Montana, sometimes for business, sometimes simply to see friends. A friendship built on respect slowly grew stronger. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. Just two people connected by an extraordinary moment and a shared understanding of what truly mattered. On warm evenings, Daniel still sat on the porch watching sunsets with Sophie. The difference was that he no longer counted days until loss. He counted blessings he almost overlooked. Because in the end, the miracle was never money. It was the reminder that kindness matters, that dignity matters, that helping someone when you have every reason to focus on yourself can change lives in ways you never expect. And perhaps the most beautiful truth of all is this: the world does not always reward kindness immediately, but kindness leaves a mark that time cannot erase. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts below and tell us what part stayed with you the most. And if you believe in second chances, quiet strength, and the power of doing the right thing when nobody is watching, consider subscribing and joining us for more stories that remind us why goodness still matters.